Yo, YouTube, what's up with your boy, Sports and Fitness Rants? I'm back, guys. Click that like button. Subscribe to my channel. What's up, y'all? Welcome back, guys. Welcome back, man. Got another great video for you guys today. As usual, man, you guys know the deal on this channel. It's all about setting the record straight, stopping the lies, stopping the narratives, stopping them from rewriting the history, bending reality, man, and holding these guys to a standard. And in this video, man, I want to talk about some of the other good to great coaches that that coached in the NBA in the 80s and the 90s, the era that I grew up watching, because oftentimes all we hear now from a lot of the Jordan detractors, the people who love to tear down Michael Jordan, is that Phil Jackson was the greatest coach of all time, which, arguably is the greatest coach of all time, but they make it seem as if Phil Jackson was the only great coach in the NBA when Michael Jordan played. And once again, he played against no competition, and the players he played against were not being coached by anybody relevant, man. You never hear them bring in many other coaches. They love to talk about Phil Jackson, man. There were many other great coaches and very good coaches in the 80s and the 90s, guys, the era I grew up watching, man. And we're going to put some respect on these guys' names, man. It ain't just Phil Jackson out there, guys. There were other teams with really good coaches and great coaches. And we're talking about this video. And I want to thank you guys, man. Everyone across the world, everyone across the states, man, has been supporting my channel, man. Much respect to all you guys out there. The true basketball fans are standing up, man. Thank you guys for standing with me, for having my back, for rolling with me. All the support, guys. Anyone that's donated to my channel, you guys leaving comments in the comments section, liking my videos. Shout out to everybody in the membership, man. Thank you to all you guys, man. You guys continue, like I said, to humble me, man, with the support. It means a lot. Thank you. And you guys know what to do. Turn the volume all the way up. Hit that play button. Remember, these videos are for educational purposes. And let's roll. So yes, guys, like I said, man, I just wanted to do a brief video and talk about some of these really good coaches and some of these great coaches that coached in the 80s and the 90s era of the NBA. And some of these coaches that I'm going to mention also coached in the 2000s. But I wanted to bring up some of these guys because, once again, whenever we hear people talk about Michael Jordan and they're trying to take away from Michael Jordan's greatness, they must try to pump up Phil Jackson into a realm that I don't believe that he's in. They'll make up narratives and lies and say things that Michael Jordan would have never won without Phil Jackson and blah, 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 blah. And they do the same thing with Scottie Pippen. But when we think about the coaches of the 80s and the 90s, the coaches of the other teams that Michael Jordan, the Bulls, were playing against, these teams were well coached, man. Once again, this is what I'm always trying to allude to you guys, man. The NBA was balanced back in them days, the golden era. You had great coaches coaching great players that ran systems, right? Think about all this stuff, man. You would see coaches running half-court traps, full-court presses, all kinds of things like this, guys. So I want to put some shine and some respect on some of these other coaches that don't get really no attention, don't get no love. They've kind of been forgotten, some of these guys. Not all these guys I'm going to mention are forgotten, but some of them are, man. And once again, they try to make it seem like only the Bulls, only Michael Jordan had a great coach, but none of the other teams had any players on them, and they didn't have no coaches in them. So one of the guys I want to bring up real quick, man, I want to bring up Lenny Wilkens. Shout out to Lenny Wilkens, man. And I've talked about Lenny Wilkens before in some of my other videos. He's a Hall of Fame player and a Hall of Fame coach, guys. That's right. Inducted into the Hall of Fame as a player and a coach. One of the great point guards in NBA history, Lenny Wilkens, and one of the all-time great coaches. Coached in the 80s and the 90s era of NBA. If you guys don't remember, Lenny Wilkens also was a player coach. I did not even know this till recently, but we often think about Bill Russell as a player coach, right? And with one of the great accomplishments of Bill Russell's career, being able to lead a team to a championship as a player while coaching them also. Lenny Wilkens was doing the same thing. Not saying he was leading the team to championships while coaching, but I believe Lenny Wilkens played and coached at the same time, guys. Played and coached at the same time. So when we think about Lenny Wilkens, man, he was coaching the Seattle Supersonics to their first and only NBA championship in 1979. Lenny Wilkens was the coach of that team. But like I told you guys, Lenny Wilkens also played and coached simultaneously. So much respect to Lenny Wilkens. That was in the 70s. Lenny Wilkens also, like I told you, as far as the 80s and the 90s is concerned, Lenny Wilkens was coaching the Cleveland Cavaliers in the 80s. So when we think about Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls playing against the Cleveland Cavaliers in the late 80s into the early 90s, those teams were coached by Lenny Wilkens, guys. And those teams were very, very formidable. I've told you guys many times on this channel. The Chicago Bulls were not supposed to be the next team up. It was supposed to be the Cleveland Cavaliers. They were supposed to be the next team up. I told you their players were further along than guys like Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant. But the X factor was always Michael Jordan, averaging like 40 points a game against the Cleveland Cavaliers in a lot of these series. And we all know about the shot 1989. That was the Cleveland Cavaliers that was coached by Lenny Wilkens, guys. They were a very, very good team. And into the early 90s, I believe Lenny Wilkens coached them to about 1993 or 1994, if I remember correctly. So don't forget, the Bulls played the Cleveland Cavaliers in the Eastern Conference Finals in 1992. They played them in the second round in 1993. Along with 1988, 1989, they played against the Cleveland Cavaliers. So you're talking about 4 separate occasions they played against the Cleveland Cavaliers from the late 80s into the early 90s. 4 times in 5 seasons? 88, 89, I believe 90, 91 are the only 2 seasons that they didn't play them. So 4 times in 6 years, they played the Cleveland Cavaliers. They were a very good team, winning 57 games, I believe, one year, 55 games another year. Like I said, they were a very, very good team on both ends, and they were very well coached by Lenny Wilkens, one of the all-time great coaches of all time, guys. Like I said, the guy was playing and coaching at the same time. A lot of people don't even realize that. So much respect to Lenny Wilkens, like I said, inducted in the Hall of Fame as a player and a coach. Not many people, guys, in NBA's history are inducted in the Hall of Fame as a player and a coach. Not Phil Jackson, right? So let's think about Lenny Wilkens, man, and put some respect on Lenny Wilkens' name, man. Like I said, he was a very great coach. And then he would eventually, after the Cleveland Cavaliers, I believe he became the coach of the Atlanta Hawks of the mid to late 90s. Once again, the Chicago Bulls beat the Atlanta Hawks, Lenny Wilkens' Atlanta Hawks, I believe in the 1997 Eastern Conference second round. And those were Atlanta Hawks with guys like Mookie Blaylock, Steve Smith, Christian Laettner, Dikembe Mutombo was on those teams. So shout out to Lenny Wilkens. Like I said, man, he was a very quality coach, man. One of the great coaches no one ever talks about in the 80s and the 90s. So shout out to Lenny Wilkens. Another guy I wanted to bring up was my boy Mike Fratello. Now, Mike Fratello is not maybe like a Hall of Fame coach or an all-time great coach that you would think. But Mike Fratello was a really quality coach, man. From the 80s into the 90s, a lot of people don't realize those Dominique Wilkins Atlanta Hawks of the mid 80s into the late 80s was coached by Mike Fratello. Mike Fratello was coaching that team. Dominique Wilkins, what's his name? Kevin Willis, Doc Rivers. These are the Atlanta Hawks that Mike Fratello was coaching, and they were a very formidable team. But once again, Mike Fratello's Hawks were running into the legendary Boston Celtics in the mid to late 80s. The Detroit Pistons of the late 80s were the teams that were beating the Atlanta Hawks. Dominique Wilkins' teams, coached by Mike Fratello, were being beat by legendary teams. The Pistons, the Celtics. These are teams that were beating them, right? So shout out to Mike Fratello. Like I said, just a really good coach from the 80s and the 90s era of NBA. Mike Fratello would go from the whole. It's funny, like Mike Fratello and Lenny Wilkens almost like were switching teams, right? Lenny Wilkens was coaching the Cavaliers, then he coached the Atlanta Hawks. Mike Fratello was coaching the Atlanta Hawks, and then after the Atlanta Hawks, he coached the Cleveland Cavaliers after Lenny Wilkens. In the mid to late 90s, Mike Fratello was the coach of those Cleveland Cavalier teams. And once again, we all know about Mike Fratello, the broadcaster, right? Him and Marv Albert and all the things that he did broadcasting-wise. So shout out to Mike Fratello, a very quality coach, like I said, and just one of the great contributors to the NBA, man, and to basketball. The czar of the telestrator, Mike Fratello, man. I used to love to listen to that guy on the broadcast. The 91 NBA Finals, one of my favorite NBA Finals, might even be my favorite NBA Finals to watch of Michael Jordan. And listening to Marv Albert and Mike Fratello go back and forth on that Finals is outstanding, man. So shout out once again to Mike Fratello. I believe he was a coach of the year in 1986, I believe, for the Atlanta Hawks. So shout out to Mike Fratello, man. Just a really quality coach, man. Another guy I wanted to bring up that you don't get much shine, Rick Adelman. I wanted to bring up Rick Adelman. Now, I believe Rick Adelman was recently elected or inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. I believe 2021 or 22. I want to say he got inducted into the Hall of Fame. So shout out to Rick Adelman. But Rick Adelman was a quality coach. Is he one of the greatest coaches of all time, a top 5 or top 10 coach? No, I wouldn't put him in that realm. But once again, he was a very quality coach. And it really, like I said, a guy that was able to take teams and bring them to the NBA Finals. So if you guys don't remember, Rick Adelman was the coach of those Portland Trailblazers teams in the late 80s into the early 90s. right? So we remember the Chicago Bulls playing the Portland Trailblazers in 1992, right? A lot of people remember that. Rick Adelman was the coach of that team. But a lot of people don't remember is that Rick Adelman and the Portland Trailblazers were also in the NBA Finals in 1990, guys. That's right. They played the Detroit Pistons in the NBA Finals in 1990, and then were in the NBA Finals again in 1992. So 2 trips in 3 seasons. So once again, shout out to Rick Adelman, but that's not the end of his claim to fame. Rick Adelman, once again, was a coach of the Sacramento Kings in the early 2000s. So like I told you, some of these guys I'm talking about from the 80s and the 90s also coached into the 2000s. And Rick Adelman was the head coach of those formidable Sacramento teams that were battling against the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. You guys remember the Sacramento Kings had guys like Mike Bibby and Bobby Jackson, Chris Webber, Vlade Divac, Jason Williams, Corliss Williamson, a young Peja Stojakovic, a young Hedo Turkoglu, I believe, were on these teams. They were a very formidable team, and they kept running into the Lakers. Right? We all remember that shot by Robert Horry, right? That was a big shot, right? That helped propel the Lakers to get past the Sacramento Kings in that series. But Rick Adelman was the coach of those teams. So once again, shout out to Rick Adelman, coach, a very quality coach from the 80s and the 90s era of NBA into the 2000s that doesn't get much shine or talked about much, but he was a very good coach of that era. So shout out to Rick Adelman. Another coach that I want to bring up is obviously Jerry Sloan. I want to bring up Jerry Sloan, obviously one of the all-time great coaches, coached the Utah Jazz for like 23 seasons or something like that. I think he coached the Utah Jazz some ridiculous amount of years. Jerry Sloan coached the Utah Jazz. And I believe at the end of his career, he was kind of ran out of there by Darren Williams. I guess Darren Williams didn't like the way that Jerry Sloan was, his demeanor. And a lot of people don't realize that Jerry Sloan played in the NBA, a very quality, hard-nosed defensive player at their shooting guard position. A lot of people consider Jerry Sloan and Norm Van Leer one of the greatest defensive backcourts in NBA's history. In NBA's history, played for the Chicago Bulls, Jerry Sloan, in the 70s. A lot of people don't realize that. Jerry Sloan was a hard-nosed, gritty guy, man. And his teams, the Utah Jazz, took on his personality. That's why the Jazz was so tough and formidable. Because they were gritty, they were hard-nosed, and they executed. The Utah Jazz were known for their execution. Right? The pick and roll, John Stockton and Karl Malone, they were known for execution, hard-nosed teams, gritty teams, giving the effort on both ends. Well coached by Jerry Sloan. So once again, shout out to Jerry Sloan, who he's been forgotten, it seems. No one ever mentions this man. Rest in peace to Jerry Sloan. And yes, one of the great coaches of that era, the 90s. We all remember Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls, going against the Utah Jazz in 97-98, and Jerry Sloan being the coach of those teams. And like I said, the Utah Jazz being very formidable, beating teams like the Los Angeles Lakers in 1998 with 4 All-Stars on them, right? Beating these teams. A lot of teams didn't want to face the Utah Jazz in the mid to late 90s. They didn't want to face the Utah Jazz because they executed, they were hard-nosed, and they were tough. They were physical, just like Jerry Sloan. So shout out to Jerry Sloan, man. Like I said, just one of the scrappy, grittiest players, a hard-nosed defensive player. I believe he made 6 times all defensive teams in his career. And his Utah Jazz took on his personality, his demeanor. Very hard-nosed team. Like I said, executed. So shout out to Jerry Sloan, someone who doesn't get mentioned much. I want to shout out to Chuck Daly. Shout out to Chuck Daly. A lot of people know Chuck Daly. But once again, I feel like Chuck Daly is underrated, undervalued. Every time you hear Isaiah Thomas talking about how he beat Michael Jordan, he never brings up Chuck Daly as the coach. Never does. Remember, guys, Chuck Daly was the head coach of the 92 Dream Team, guys. Chuck Daly, not Phil Jackson, not Jerry Sloan or some of these other guys I've mentioned. And I believe Lenny Wilkins was one of the assistants on that team. But it was Chuck Daly. Never called a timeout during the Olympics. Not one single timeout. The entire 92 Olympics, guys. Unheard of. Remarkable. But Chuck Daly, once again, a master of personalities. The swag of Chuck Daly. The dude was like a gangster out there, man. These guys always look sharp. They had the suits on. And once again, Chuck Daly, coaching of the Detroit Pistons from the mid to late 80s into the early 90s, guys. I believe he coached the Pistons till 1992 or 1993, somewhere around there. But then he would coach the New Jersey Nets for a couple of seasons. I believe he coached the Orlando Magic for like a year. But shout out to Chuck Daly. We all know him from coaching the Detroit Pistons, back-to-back champions, right? 5 consecutive trips to the Eastern Conference Finals from 87 or 88 to 1991. And we all know that the Chicago Bulls played against the Detroit Pistons, coached by Chuck Daly in the 91 Eastern Conference Finals. And like I said, the very next year, Chuck Daly would be coaching Michael Jordan on the Dream Team. So shout out to Chuck Daly, one of the all-time great coaches, but for some reason, his name never gets brought up. Everyone always wants to talk about Phil Jackson this, Phil Jackson that. Chuck Daly is an all-time legendary coach, man. Like I said, galvanized the Detroit Pistons, man, and was able to lead them to multiple, to back-to-back championships, man, right? Instituting things like the Jordan rules. They were a hard-nosed, tough, physical team, man. Chuck Daly worked with what he had. He used what he had, the players that he had, their styles, and he made it work. So once again, shout out to Chuck Daly, one of the all-time great coaches. Rest in peace to Chuck Daly. Another guy I want to mention, obviously, Pat Riley. Pat Riley, shout out to Pat Riley. I swear, people act like Pat Riley only coached in the 80s. Pat Riley was a coach in the 90s, guys, all throughout the 90s. Pat Riley, one of the legendary coaches, one of the greatest coaches of all time. You could argue he's the greatest coach of all time. You could argue that. We all know about his success on the Lakers. But a lot of people forget, Pat Riley was the coach of the New York Knicks in the early 90s that were formidable. And he was the coach of the Miami Heat for many, many years, from the late 90s all the way to the 2000s. And Pat Riley, everywhere he went, he was successful. Not just the Lakers. He was successful with the New York Knicks. Never led them to a championship. But once again, he had them very formidable, going up against the Chicago Bulls. I believe he came in the New York Knicks in 1992, I want to say, and immediately turned them around. Once again, working with what he had and instituting a very hard-nosed, physical style of defense. The New York Knicks of the early 90s were very formidable on the defensive end, with guys like Patrick Ewing, Charles Oakley, Xavier McDaniel, Anthony Mason, John Starks. All these hard-nosed kind of players, guys who gave effort out there, right? This is what Pat Riley did with the New York Knicks. Had them in the Eastern Conference Finals, coached them to 60 wins in 1993. And they were up 2 games to nothing, Chicago Bulls, before Michael Jordan turned it on. And a lot of people don't realize, Phil Jackson and Pat Riley did not like each other in the early 90s, man, because Phil Jackson was getting upset with the style of play of the New York Knicks of the early 90s, because he was trying to relate it to the Detroit Pistons of the late 80s and the dirty tactics of the Detroit Pistons. But I've told you guys many times, to me, the New York Knicks of the early 90s were not a dirty team. They were a physical, hard-nosed team, a blue-collar team, but I never thought of them as dirty. So the Detroit Pistons were a dirty team, but Pat Riley and Phil Jackson were going back and forth in papers in 92 and in 93. So shout out to Pat Riley, but a lot of people also forget, Pat Riley was the coach of the Miami Heat in the late 90s with guys like Alonzo Mourning, Tim Hardaway, Dan Marley, Vashawn Leonard. They had a good team, and they won the Eastern Conference Finals in 1997. And they won, I believe they won 60 games in 1990. They might even won 61 games like that in 1997. But they were coached by Pat Riley. Everywhere this man went, he turned franchise around. He was successful there. He had them competitive. And the Eastern Conference Finals in 1997, they faced the Chicago Bulls. We all remember that series, right? Alonzo Mourning elbowed Scottie Pippen in the head. He had that giant knot in his head, right? And then Michael Jordan said, what? It's personal now with us. Once again, Phil Jackson versus Pat Riley. Michael Jordan versus Pat Riley. So shout out to Pat Riley, one of the great coaches who coached for many years in the 90s, guys, all the way into the 2000s, man. But people seem to have forgotten that Pat Riley was in the NBA when Phil Jackson was in the NBA in the 90s. It wasn't just Phil Jackson. I want to shout out to Jeff Van Gundy real quick. I know this video's getting kind of long. Shout out to Jeff Van Gundy. He's a really quality coach, too, of the 90s. He came in after Pat Riley left. Remember, Jeff Van Gundy was an assistant on those New York Knicks squads under Pat Riley. And then when Pat Riley left to Miami, Jeff Van Gundy became the head coach of the New York Knicks from the mid to late 90s. Once again, you remember, the Bulls played those New York Knicks, I believe, in the second round in 1996, I want to say. And remember, Jeff Van Gundy calling Michael Jordan a con man, right? Oh, Michael Jordan's a con man. He tries to, get the players to think that he's friends with them, and then he used that friendship to his advantage. This is what Jeff Van Gundy said publicly. And Michael Jordan went at him about that on the basketball court. Shut him up. It became personal. But Jeff Van Gundy is a very quality coach. Jeff Van Gundy, I believe, also coached the Houston Rockets, I want to say, of the 2000s with Tracy McGrady, Yao Ming. I believe he was a coach of that team for a couple of years. And they were an up-and-coming team. If Tracy McGrady, Yao Ming could stay healthy and be on the court at the same time, they would have been very, very formidable. So shout out to Jeff Van Gundy. I just wanted to throw him out there, bring his name up, because he was a very quality coach, man, of the mid to late 90s into those 2000s. So shout out once again to Jeff Van Gundy. So as you guys can see, this video's gone a little bit longer than I thought. Shout out to all those guys I mentioned, man. They were very quality coaches. Some of those guys were all-time great coaches, the Jerry Sloans, the Chuck Daly's, the Pat Rileys. These are all-time great coaches, Lenny Wilkins. And then you have the other guys, the Mike Fratellos that were coaching during that same time, the Jeff Van Gundys. Some of these other guys, Don Nelson, some of these guys that I think about. So shout out to all those guys, man. Like I said, they don't get mentioned much. People act as if Phil Jackson was the only great coach in the 90s, or the Bulls, Michael Jordan. They only had a great coach. No other teams had great coaches. Rick Adelman, shout out to him again. Like I said, so all those guys were very good coaches, man. And there were many great coaches, like I said, that ran actual systems. Like I said, they would half-court trap you. They would full-court press you. All these things, man, they ran actual systems. They coached guys up to the fundamentals of basketball. So shout out to those guys, man. You guys know the deal on this channel. We must continue to put some respect on the past eras. We can't allow them to bend reality and rewrite the history. Phil Jackson is one of the greatest coaches of all time, if not the greatest coach of all time. And no one's ever taken anything away from him. But the way that they try to make it seem as if Michael Jordan and Chicago Bulls had some unfair advantage because Phil Jackson's a great coach. Once again, where was Phil Jackson before the Chicago Bulls? He was nowhere. Guys like Lenny Wilkins, guys like Mike Fratello, they were already established coaches. Right? These guys were already doing things before Phil Jackson even came in. Rick Adelman was in the NBA Finals in 1990. Phil Jackson's first year. We all know about Jerry Sloan, all the years that he was battling in that Western Conference. So shout out to those guys, man. Much respect. I throw Larry Brown out there too, man. I believe Larry Brown coached a couple of years in the 90s, or some years in the 90s. I believe, if I remember correctly, I believe he coached the San Antonio Spurs for a couple of years. I might be wrong about that, but I could have sworn that I remember Larry Brown coaching some of those teams, man. So shout out to him too also, man. You guys know the deal, man. I'll catch you guys on the next one.